Today on Sports Central, we'll be going over our 2020 XFL Week 3 Power Rankings as well as a recap over Week number 2 and looking at each one of these teams as we head towards Week number 3 of the XFL season. Starting off with number 8, it's going to be the Tampa Bay Vipers. This team last week lost to the Seattle Dragons 9-17. This is a pretty tough game for this team. But nonetheless, there are a lot of question marks on this Vipers team as well. Of course, they've got a really bad quarterback situation going right now. They've already played 3 quarterbacks in the first 2 weeks of the season. They had Aaron Murray last week, which of course Aaron Murray didn't play all that well. But this week they had Quinton Flowers and Taylor Cornelius taking over at the quarterback position, and Cornelius led stat-wise. But overall, it was still a pretty terrible game for him. 16 for 27, 154 yards, but 2 interceptions and no touchdowns is really the factor that you got to watch out for. But nonetheless, former Florida State running back Jaquez Patrick, he led the rushing corps with 14 attempts, 73 yards, and quite frankly, he was the best part of this offense this past week. Top wide receiver was Horn, who had 5 receptions for 51 yards and no touchdowns. And so, yeah, this Vipers team was number 8 last week. They're going to be number 8 this week as well. And I think they're going to be at the number 8 position for quite a long time if they can't get the quarterback situation figured out. Looking ahead for the Vipers, next week they've got a really tough date with the Houston Roughnecks at home. That's going to be a really tough game to play there, and if they can get a win, that would be absolutely insane. Of course, the Roughnecks, I believe, are one of the best XFL teams currently in the league, so you got to watch out for that. But nonetheless, number 7 is going to be the Los Angeles Wildcats. This team last week lost to the Renegades 18-25, and this team is now 0-2. Last week they were number 7 as well. And of course, Josh Johnson, their quarterback, he was starting this week, 18 for 34, 196 yards and 2 touchdowns. So overall, he did not have all that bad of a day at all. And of course, Nelson Spruce continues to be one of the league's best wide receivers, which he had 6 receptions for 89 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also led the team in receiving last week as well. So he's a pretty big bright spot of this offense, but this offense just could not get it done again this week against Dallas. Of course, they kept it close, though, 18-25. That's not all that bad. But nonetheless, their top running back was Hood, who had 10 attempts for 31 yards. So really, he didn't put up all that impressive of a performance. But nonetheless, looking ahead for the Wildcats, they have the Defenders next week, which quite possibly the DC Defenders are probably the best team in the league right now, looking at how they've played. So that's going to be a really tough game for the Wildcats next week. Number 6 is going to be the New York Guardians, and this team dropped 3 positions after last week's performance against the DC Defenders. Of course, they were ranked number 3 last week, but considering their win last week was against the Vipers, it's a little bit concerning for the Guardians right now. Their current record is 1-1, and Matt McGloin absolutely played horrible in this game. He was 8 for 19, 44 yards and 2 interceptions. That's a pretty terrible performance if you ask me. So I do expect the Guardians to probably go with a different quarterback full time next week. So that's a little bit concerning for the Guardians heading into the middle parts of this season. Top running back was Cook last week, 10 attempts for 39 yards, and their top wide receiver was McKay, who had 3 receptions for 30 yards and no touchdowns. So there were no impressive performances on this team last week. Absolutely nothing. They just could not do absolutely anything on offense. This DC Defenders team absolutely shredded their offense. I mean, no doubt about it. And that's pretty concerning heading into week number 3. Nonetheless, number 5 this week is going to be the Seattle Dragons. This team is going to be moving up 1 position after week number 1. And they beat the Tampa Bay Vipers 17-9 this past week. Their current record is now 1-1. And there are a few good players on this team. Of course, their quarterback, Brandon Silvers, was 7 for 18, 91 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. So overall, that's not a very good performance, but of course, he was able to put up a touchdown for this team, so that is really good. Top running back was Williams, 11 attempts for 45 yards, no touchdowns, and their top wide receiver was Reynolds this week, 3 receptions for 87 yards and 1 touchdown, that's pretty impressive for only 3 receptions. To have 87 yards there, that's pretty good. And of course, the Dragons did have to rally in this game. They were down 9-0 at one point in this game to the Vipers, so they did end up winning it by a 17-9 score. But you do got to keep in mind that this team was down for a good chunk of this game. Looking ahead for the Seattle Dragons, though, they play the Renegades next week. That should be a really intriguing matchup. I think both those teams are pretty evenly matched right now. Number 4 is going to be the St. Louis BattleHawks, and this team is going to be staying at the same position as they were last week at number 4. And of course, they took a loss this week to the Houston Roughnecks, 24-28. But this was actually a pretty impressive performance, in my opinion, by St. Louis. I expected them to get beat up in this game. Of course, the BattleHawks heading into the season were far from being the favorite team to end up winning the XFL, but they've proved a lot of people wrong. Of course, Jordan Ta'amu has been really excellent for this team. 30 for 37, 284 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. He had a very impressive performance, and quite honestly, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me to see the BattleHawks contend in nearly every single game with Ta'amu at quarterback. Of course, he's playing really well right now, and he's probably the best quarterback in the league, quite honestly, at this point. Top running back was Jones, 16 attempts for 44 yards. Not all that impressive, and their top wide receiver was Washington, which he was an okay performance, 6 receptions for 36 yards and a touchdown. And looking ahead for the BattleHawks now, next week they've got a date with the Guardians at home, and that should be an interesting matchup there. Of course, the Guardians took a really bad loss this past week, so it'll be interesting to see if the Guardians can bounce back from that and how St. Louis does next week as well. Number 3 is going to be the Dallas Renegades. This team is going to be jumping 2 positions up to number 3 this week. And of course, you may have a couple of disagreements with this. Of course, with the BattleHawks beating the Renegades in week number 1, you may think the BattleHawks should still be ahead of the Renegades. But in my opinion, now with Landry Jones at quarterback, I think that this team has a whole lot of more potential. Of course, they beat the Wildcats last week 25-18. It wasn't all that impressive of a win, but I think if Landry Jones can continue to play better, I think that this Renegades team could easily contend to win this entire league. But he was 28 for 40, 305 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions. So it was a decent one. Of course, he does not want to have 2 interceptions for every game this season. They won't win more than 4 games with Landry Jones having 2 interceptions every single game. But nonetheless, their top running back was Artis Payne, 14 attempts for 99 yards and 2 touchdowns. Then the top wide receiver was Parham this week, 5 receptions for 76 yards and 1 touchdown. But yeah, once again, I think for the Dallas Renegades, if Landry Jones can continue to play well, if he does play well, I think that they've got so much potential. I mean, coming into this season, I'm sure by many analysts, by many people, the Dallas Renegades were actually predicted to win the XFL League this season. And for me especially, I mean, I thought the Renegades would be my favorite as well. And I mean, with Landry Jones and all this talent, no doubt about it, they've got potential to do that. Looking ahead for the Renegades, though, next week they've got to go to Seattle, play the Dragons. Should be an interesting matchup there as well. Number 2 is going to be the Houston Roughnecks. This team beat the BattleHawks last week, 28-24. Good win there. And they are 2-0. Last week they were number 1, and they're actually going to be dropping a position to the DC Defenders, which they'll be up next. And we'll go over more on that reason in a second. But looking at the Roughnecks this week, their top quarterback was Walker, 20 for 31, 170 yards and 3 touchdowns. So overall, he had a really good performance. But yeah, it was a back and forth battle, no doubt about it. I mean, both these teams were back and forth the entire time, and it was a bit of a controversial ending as well. But nonetheless, I mean, the Roughnecks, they were still able to get the win. They played better in the end. And of course, wide receiver Phillips probably had the biggest performance of any wide receiver this week. 8 receptions for 63 yards and 3 touchdowns, and he had all 3 of Walker's passing touchdowns. Top running back this week was Butler, who had 7 attempts for 28 yards and 1 touchdown as well. So of course, Roughnecks definitely have one of the best quarterbacks in the league with Walker, and I mean, they ought to be really confident in him. Looking ahead for the Roughnecks, they play the Vipers next week. Should be an easy win there. If everything goes right, of course. If they botch that could be an absolutely terrible loss. But the Roughnecks definitely need a win next week in order to make it onto the playoffs. Number 1 team and your leader for this week is going to be the DC Defenders. And this week, they were number 2 last week, but of course they're going to be number 1 this week, in my opinion. I mean, you can't top a performance like how they had. They beat the number 3 ranked team from last week, the New York Guardians, 27-0, completely shut them out. They absolutely shredded the Guardians offense. I mean, if you look back on what the stats were for this Guardians team last week, of course, Matt McGloin, no player on that team was able to even get above 50 yards. It was crazy. Matt McGloin, I think, only had 44 yards. It was crazy. But nonetheless, this team's looking really good. Quarterback Cardale Jones, of course, from Ohio State. You may remember him. 23 for 37, 276 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Very impressive performance there. Of course, if you can drop the interception, that'd be even better. A lot of these quarterbacks in this league have interceptions every single game, too. So, I mean, if you can get a quarterback that doesn't like interceptions, that doesn't commit interceptions, certainly that'd be huge for any one of these teams. Top running back was Pumphrey for this team last week. 12 attempts for 52 yards, and your top wide receiver was Ross, 4 receptions for 95 yards. So pretty impressive performance to have 95 yards on only 4 receptions. Looking ahead for the defenders next week, they should get a win against the Los Angeles Wildcats on the road. Really, I think our 1 and 2 should stay the same going into our week number 4 rankings as well, because I mean the top 2 teams in my rankings right now, the Defenders and the Roughnecks, both play the Wildcats and the Vipers. So overall, we should see both teams getting wins. But nonetheless, let me know your thoughts on these in the comments below. Let me know what you think of the Defenders. Let me know who you'd be, who would be your number 1 team this week. Let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys all for watching. Be sure to stay tuned for more from All Sports Central, and I will see you all later.